Let's talk about President Taft and dollar diplomacy, what was known as dollar diplomacy. Taft brought some foreign policy credentials to the job of president. He had governed the Philippines, and as Secretary of War, he had negotiated several agreements, including the delicate Taft-Katsura Agreement of 1905. Yet he lacked TR's grasp of balance of power politics and his capacity for leadership. He therefore relied heavily on his Secretary of State, Philander K. Knox, who was a corporate lawyer. Knox's conduct of foreign policy seemed almost entirely focused on expanding opportunities for corporate investment overseas. His policies were often, therefore, described as dollar diplomacy. This was usually not a compliment. This was not entirely as morally bankrupt as it sounds. Taft and Knox believed that U.S. investments would substitute dollars for bullets, implying that diplomacy had become more commercial than the old balance of power model, i.e. they thought it was more moral to send dollars in to dominate rather than guns, but they were wrong about power not mattering as much. This failure to grasp the complexities of power politics would lead to some diplomatic reversals in East Asia, although some qualified successes in the Western Hemisphere. The examples we'll discuss are Manchuria, the Banana Republics, the Nicaraguan intervention, and to some degree Mexico. Now, Knox, prodded by his banker buddies, sought to expand U.S. economic activities throughout China, including Manchuria, northern province of China. Here you see it listed as Manchukuo. Eventually it would become totally taken over by the Japanese. This would be one of the acts of aggression leading to World War II. They would rename it the Japanese word Manchukuo. But anyway, Knox wanted to, expand U.S. economic activities in China, including Manchuria, and they clearly would encroach on the Japanese sphere of influence there. In 1911, Knox proposed that a group of American and European bankers buy the Japanese-controlled Southern Manchurian Railroad to open up North China to international trade. This involved a railroad promoter who envisioned a global rail link, which, by the way, has only recently become fulfilled. You can now travel by rail from London to Hong Kong. Ask me about that sometime. Japan reacted not well to this attempt by signing a friendship treaty with Russia, who was its recent enemy, which signaled their joint determination to exclude American, British, and French goods and economic dominance in Manchurian markets. Russia essentially controlled by now the north of Manchuria as a sphere of influence, and Japan the south. Knox's plan to buy the railroad collapsed, and the open-door policy suffered a serious blow. It wasn't equally open to all, clearly. Knox's further efforts to increase U.S. trade in central and southern China further angered Russia and Japan, and really played a part in contributing to the collapse of the Chinese government in 1912, in the revolution in which the Qing dynasty finally collapsed. Now, dollar diplomacy worked much better in Latin America, where no major power really contested U.S. dominance. Knox urged U.S. investment. That's the point of dollar diplomacy. U.S. companies, of which United Fruit of Boston is a prime example, established extensive produce plantations, primarily bananas, and railroad networks to support them in Costa Rica and Honduras, where United Fruit, particularly in those two countries, had a near monopoly and enough power to influence both the economies and the governments of those countries. When political turmoil or corruption would threaten their investments, the U.S. would simply send in the troops. There are too many instances of this to list. These are sometimes referred to as the banana wars, in these places as banana republics. This is where we get the term banana republic. Any perceived threat to the new canal could particularly set off American intervention. When Nicaraguan dictator Jose Santos Zelaya began negotiating in 1910 with European entities to build a second canal through Nicaragua, a competitor, a force of U.S. Marines toppled his regime. They couldn't have that. His successor, Adolfo Diaz, was essentially an American puppet. The U.S. persuaded American banks to loan him $1.5 million in exchange for control of the National Bank, the Customs Service, the fiscal tax collecting part of the government, and the railroads. In other words, the U.S. Took over this country in all but name. When Nicaraguans, angered by the pro-American policies of Diaz, rose up against him in 1912, the U.S. invaded again to keep him in power. And except for a brief time in 1925, the troops remained continuously from 1912 until 1933. Under Taft, the U.S. continued to do whatever policymakers deemed necessary to bolster friendly governments and maintain order in Latin America. Now, most textbooks do not list Mexico as a supporting incident when describing the dollar diplomacy of Taft, but it bears mention. The U.S. had begun pouring money into Mexico, or had been pouring money into Mexico for decades, and controlled a large portion of the Mexican economy. The capitalist policies of longtime President Porfirio Diaz aided enormously in this effort, partly, though the causes are complex, as you'll learn, partly due to the resentment of American economic domination. A revolution broke out against Diaz in 1910. When Taft was president. Taft's ambassador to Mexico, Henry Lane Wilson, was a corporate lawyer, and dollar diplomat, just like Knox, and actually helped engineer a counter-revolution to return to the dollar-friendly policies of Diaz. It was disastrous. Much more about that later.